He walked in like a ghost the world had forgotten. Gray cap, scuffed shoes, and a folded check clutched gently in his calloused hand. No fanfare, no entourage, just a 76-year-old man standing in line at one of the most powerful financial institutions in the city, holding a piece of paper worth $5 million. The young banker behind the desk didn't even look up at first. When he finally did, he smirked, leaned back in his ergonomic chair, and said loud enough for others to hear, "You sure you're in the right place, sir?" The old man didn't flinch. He politely handed over the check, explained that he wanted to wire the funds to several nonprofit organizations and settle the final invoice for a veterans' housing project. The banker laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A dismissive, arrogant chuckle that echoed across the marble lobby. "This has to be a joke," he said, waving the check in the air like a discarded receipt. "Do you even know what a transaction this size means? We're talking about compliance, verification, fraud prevention, sir." Then louder, to no one in particular, "Someone call security. We've got another genius here with a fake check." Clients turned their heads. Some chuckled. A few whispered. One pulled out a phone and began recording. The banker continued, "Sir, this isn't some grocery store. This is a federal bank. Do you understand what you're handing me?" He was enjoying the show, enjoying the humiliation of a man who didn't look like he belonged in that space. But the old man didn't storm out. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Please call your branch manager. She'll know who I am." That pushed the banker over the edge. "Our manager doesn't have time for walk-ins with fantasy money," he said. "If this check were real, I'd quit my job on the spot." The room fell quiet. A moment passed. Then the elevator dinged, and down came a woman in a navy blue blazer, heels clicking against the floor like a metronome of urgency. Her eyes scanned the room, then locked on the old man. Her face went pale. She sprinted toward him, ignoring the line, the customers, the cameras, and what she did next silenced the entire building. Not because of the amount on the check, not because of who the man was, but because everyone just realized they'd laughed at the person who once saved the very bank they now worked for. Of all the people who had walked through the glass doors of the Bank of Dover, no one ever imagined that the quietest customer of the day would turn out to be the most powerful one. As the manager rushed forward and reached the elderly man, she didn't hesitate. "Mr. Booker," she said, her voice breaking with both shock and regret, "I am so sorry. I didn't know you were coming in today." The young banker, Bryce McConnell, stared in confusion. This couldn't be real. This old man, the one he had just humiliated in front of half the branch, was being addressed with a level of deference usually reserved for board members or federal officials. "Please," the manager continued, "come with me. We'll take care of everything immediately." But Elijah Booker didn't move. Not yet. He turned slowly to the stunned lobby, looked at Bryce, and then glanced at the recording phones that were still held mid-air. The moment was thick with discomfort. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but clear. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about the way people like him are trained to see people like me." That one sentence changed the energy in the room. It wasn't anger. It was a revelation, and it forced Bryce to step back, not physically, but mentally, because for the first time in his professional life, he had no idea who he was actually speaking to. The manager, Mary Ann Doyle, gently guided Mr. Booker toward the VIP meeting room. Inside, the mood was different, softer. She poured him a cup of black coffee and asked if he needed anything else. He declined. "Mary Ann," he said, finally settling into the leather chair, "how long has it been?" "Almost 16 years, she replied, nervously tucking her hair behind her ear. "Back then, I was just your intern. You showed me how to build a rescue model that saved this bank after the crash." Elijah nodded slowly. And now? She hesitated. Now I'm the regional director. There was a brief smile between them, one of mutual respect, but it faded quickly. I assume you saw what happened out there, Elijah said. Marianne's expression turned dark. Yes, we'll deal with it. But Elijah raised a hand. Not just discipline. Bryce isn't the problem. He's a symptom. That phrase landed heavy. It wasn't about personal revenge. Elijah Booker was talking about the system, about how institutions, even well-meaning ones, often reward arrogance over discernment. Over the next 10 minutes, they reviewed the check. It was real. The funds were part of an investment trust Booker had helped establish after the 2008 collapse. While most walked away from the financial disaster in silence, Elijah had remained behind the scenes, helping rebuild the bank's capital structure in exchange for preferred shares. Shares that had quietly matured to the multi-million-dollar payout he now carried in his coat pocket. Marianne asked why he hadn't come in earlier, or why he didn't send someone to handle the transfer. Elijah simply said, "Because I wanted to see what your front line looks like now." There was no bitterness in his tone, only clarity. It's easy to talk about equity and inclusion in the boardroom. I wanted to see if it lives in the lobby. Marianne looked away. She knew the answer. And it wasn't good. Elijah reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were detailed instructions to wire the funds to 3 community programs: a housing initiative for disabled veterans, a scholarship fund for underserved high school graduates, and a medical relief grant for Black families in rural counties. Marianne's hands trembled slightly as she read through the documents. "Mr. Booker, this is extraordinary." "It's overdue," he replied. Marianne carefully set the folder down, her thoughts racing. She had sat in countless meetings about community engagement, CSR strategies, and diversity pledges. But what lay before her wasn't a PowerPoint or a PR draft. It was impact, real, direct, and impossible to spin. She looked up at Elijah, who was now sipping his coffee with a calmness that only decades of navigating rooms full of powerful people could afford. "You never wanted credit, did you?" she asked, almost to herself. Elijah smiled faintly. "Credit doesn't build housing. It doesn't pay medical bills. And it sure doesn't undo the look on that young man's face when he thought I didn't belong." His tone was gentle, but every word cut clean. Meanwhile, outside the VIP room, the branch lobby was in subtle disarray. Bryce sat at his desk, but no longer in control. A senior compliance officer had arrived, called in discreetly by Marianne to begin a formal inquiry, not just into Bryce's conduct, but into the overall customer service culture of the branch. The live stream clip had already hit social media, gaining traction under hashtags like Silent Power and He Saved the Bank. A few comments read, "This is why you treat everyone with respect. That old man just schooled a whole generation. I hope that banker gets demoted to the mailroom." Bryce scrolled through the posts with growing dread. But what shook him more was the voice in his head, replaying Elijah's sentence. "It's not about me. It's about how you're trained to see me." That line stuck. It challenged everything he thought he knew about professionalism, status, and success. Inside the private room, Marianne asked if Elijah would allow a press release to share the story publicly. "Not yet," he said. "Let the story walk on its own. People don't need to see my face. They need to examine their own." He stood up slowly, straightened his jacket, and added, "But do one thing for me." "Anything," Marianne said. Elijah tapped the folder. "Make sure every cent goes exactly where it's meant to, and if anyone gets in the way, call me." That last part was delivered with the gentle steel of someone who, while kind, had never forgotten how to pull strings. As Marianne promised her full oversight, Elijah began walking toward the exit. But just before he left the room, he turned back. Oh, and tell your intern team to spend 1 day a week in the lobby. Let them see who's really walking in. Marianne nodded, a lump in her throat. We will. By the time Elijah returned to the lobby, it had grown quiet. Clients whispered. Some stood. Bryce rose automatically, unsure whether to apologize or hide. But Elijah didn't even look at him, not out of spite, but because the lesson had already been delivered. He didn't need to add anything else. He walked past the front desk, out the glass doors, and into the cool afternoon air. Just an old man with quiet dignity and a folded coat, leaving behind a system that now had no choice but to look in the mirror. The fallout didn't take long to begin. By the time Elijah Booker made it halfway down the block, a ripple had already spread through the entire building like a silent alarm. The regional compliance officer arrived within the hour, not because of a scheduling coincidence, but because Marianne Doyle had sent a direct message marked Priority Culture Failure. She didn't mince words. Bryce was escorted into a glass-walled office and asked to explain, on record, what had occurred. At first he stammered about standard fraud protocols and red flags, but none of it held. His own co-workers, many of whom had witnessed the exchange, weren't willing to shield him. One even admitted under her breath, "He treats all the elderly clients that way, especially the ones who don't dress like tech bros." Meanwhile, the video had gone viral. The title alone had hooked tens of thousands. He laughed at the old man's check. Then the bank froze. The thumbnail captured the moment Marianne reached Elijah, face pale, urgency in every step. On Twitter, on Reddit, even in niche finance forums, the comments flowed non-stop. You never know who you're disrespecting. Banks need to teach humility, not just compliance. Elijah Booker deserves a statue in that lobby. At a national level, syndicated media outlets picked it up. Retired economist and veteran investor snubbed by banker, then revealed to be the man who rebuilt their system. Elijah's name resurfaced, and with it came his legacy. His 2009 white paper, titled Stability Without Greed, began trending again in policy circles. It was downloaded 60,000 times in 24 hours. But back inside the bank, the real reckoning had begun. Bryce was offered a choice. Enter into a 6-month unpaid reassignment program focused on community outreach and cultural bias training, or resign immediately. He chose the former, not out of grace, but because quitting would follow him like a stain, and he knew it. On the surface, it looked like damage control, but to Marianne, it was the beginning of a culture shift she had long pushed for and never quite achieved until now. That week, she sent out a branch-wide memo implementing a new frontline policy. Every employee, regardless of title, would spend 1 day per quarter in direct service with underserved communities. No exceptions. She named it the Booker Protocol. Employees would work shifts at food banks, senior centers, and financial literacy programs. The goal wasn't charity, it was perspective. The next Monday, a framed copy of Elijah's original stock transfer document was hung quietly behind the service desk just above eye level. The words at the bottom had been circled in red. All capital means nothing without human respect. Customers noticed. Some asked about it. Others smiled quietly, knowing the story. Still, Marianne wasn't done. She scheduled an emergency board meeting, remote but mandatory. On the call, she shared footage of the incident, the response, and the broader implications. "This is not just a PR moment," she said. "This is a value reset. If our front desk can't reflect our mission, then our mission is just marketing." No one objected. The silence was telling. But the true peak came days later when the bank received a letter, handwritten, no return address. It simply read, "Tell your team this. Kindness is cheaper than regret." Enclosed was a check for $2.5 million. Anonymous. Marianne knew exactly who sent it, and so did Bryce. The story didn't end with a viral clip or a quiet internal memo. It kept building, like a storm gathering power in the background of corporate calm. 3 days after the incident, an investigative article appeared in the Wall Street Ledger titled, "The Man Who Rebuilt the Bank They Tried to Forget." It was sharp, unforgiving, and full of receipts. The piece traced Elijah Booker's post-crash involvement with over a dozen institutions, not just Bank of Dover. It detailed how he was offered a high-ranking position in the National Economic Advisory Council during the Obama administration and quietly turned it down. Instead, he chose to work behind the scenes, writing fiscal stability strategies, funding grassroots financial education programs, and advising community banks on ethical lending frameworks. The headline alone drew millions of views. Suddenly, Booker was no longer just the old man with the check. He was a national conversation. TV segments titled "Hidden Heroes of American Finance" featured him. A podcast interview from 5 years ago where he discussed building wealth with dignity resurfaced and topped Apple charts overnight. But while the public praised him, the institution that humiliated him had to decide what it would become next. Inside the bank's downtown headquarters, a hush fell over senior leadership. The board convened a confidential ethics review to investigate how many past clients had been similarly profiled, dismissed based on clothing, speech, or skin tone. Internal documents leaked. It turned out Elijah wasn't the first elderly black client to be laughed at, just the first to go viral. That revelation hit hard. Public pressure grew. A former scholarship recipient from Elijah's Education Foundation posted a heartfelt video. "I used to mop the floors of this bank. Now I own a fintech startup. The only reason I got to college was because of a man none of you ever saw on magazine covers. His name is Elijah Booker." The post exploded, pulling in comments from professors, veterans, and small business owners who had all benefited from initiatives quietly funded by Elijah's trusts. Meanwhile, Bryce McConnell was summoned for one final meeting, this time not with HR, but with the Diversity and Inclusion Council. They didn't come to scold him. They invited him to speak. At a high school. In the same underserved neighborhood, Elijah grew up. Bryce froze. "You want me to what?" The program coordinator, a calm woman named Denise, replied, "Talk about the mistake. Talk about what you learned. And don't sugarcoat it." Bryce had never felt more exposed. But deep down, he knew this was accountability, not punishment. He agreed. A week later, he stood in front of 150 juniors and seniors in a public high school gym. No PowerPoint, no podium, just raw honesty. "I judged a man by his coat," he began. "I thought I was the future of finance. Turns out I didn't know my own history." The students didn't cheer. They listened. That was more powerful. When the talk ended, one hand went up. A young man in a school hoodie asked, "Did you ever tell him you were sorry?" Bryce's face flushed. "No," he said, "but I will." And he meant it. What no one outside the vault-level files of the bank had seen, until now, was Elijah Booker's signature. Not just on the check, but on an agreement dated 15 years earlier, buried under legal layers of restructuring. In that document, Elijah had been granted preferred stakeholder authority, giving him advisory access to key policy decisions should he choose to invoke it. He never had, until now. The twist wasn't that he had money. The twist was that, quietly, through years of patience and well-timed reinvestments, Elijah had grown to become the bank's single largest non-executive shareholder, controlling a block of stock that allowed him to challenge executive votes. Not for ego, not for power, for principle. That discovery came from a young financial analyst named Lucas, who worked under Marianne Doyle. He found it while running internal compliance audits following the incident. When he showed it to her, she blinked, then laughed in disbelief. "So, we've been ignoring the most influential man in the building?" Lucas nodded. Basically, yes. He owns 12.4% of the voting stock through layered trusts. That's more than the CFO. Marianne picked up her phone, dialed Elijah directly, not his assistant, not an intermediary, and said, "Sir, would you consider joining our quarterly oversight committee?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Elijah replied, "Only if the committee meets at the same table where you made that young man stand while being mocked. Humility isn't a department, it's a location." Meanwhile, Bryce McConnell did more than just deliver a speech. He went to the veterans' housing site that Elijah's funds had built. He met the superintendent. He helped paint a fence, not because he had to, but because he couldn't sit in comfort while others carried the weight of redemption for him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't social media worthy, but it was real. Back at the bank, a formal press release was drafted, carefully worded, thoroughly reviewed, but it was Elijah who made the final edit. He crossed out the phrase, "Mr. Booker's generosity," and replaced it with Mr. Booker's enduring belief that respect should never be performance-based. The release went live the next morning, and it hit differently. Unlike corporate apologies drenched in legal phrasing, this one carried conviction. Comments flooded in. Clients returned with handwritten notes. One elderly woman walked in with tears and whispered to a teller, "He gave us our dignity back." The bank's stock rose by 2.7% that week, not because of damage control, but because investors saw something rare: integrity. Elijah didn't sell his shares. He didn't cash out. Instead, he established a standing discretionary grant where dividends from his holdings would automatically fund education, housing, and medical aid in underserved zip codes. Every quarter. Quietly. Indefinitely. And for the first time in its century-long history, the Bank of Dover did something unheard of. It renamed its main lobby. Not after a founder, not after a donor, but after a principal. The brass plaque near the entrance now reads, "The Elijah Booker Hall, where everyone deserves to be seen." The ripple effect didn't stop at the lobby. 2 weeks after the renaming, a private symposium was held in New York titled Ethics, Equity, and the Future of Banking. Normally reserved for high-profile economists and Fortune 500 CEOs, this year's keynote speaker wasn't a billionaire or a Harvard professor. It was Elijah Booker. He walked onto the stage with no notes, no slides, just a gray suit and a presence that commanded attention without asking for it. The crowd leaned in, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't need to. "We've trained a generation to chase numbers," he began. "But what happens when those numbers come wrapped in assumptions? When you value a client by their clothes, their age, their zip code, you don't just risk a mistake. You invite a collapse of trust." He paused, letting the silence teach more than the words. Then he added, "I didn't come back to teach banking. I came back to remind you that the floor of every great institution is built on how it treats its quietest visitors." The speech went viral. News anchors quoted it. Professors assigned it. Young financial interns printed it and pinned it above their desks. And somewhere in the corner of the crowd, Bryce McConnell sat quietly, hands folded, taking notes, not on finance, but on decency. Behind the scenes, other banks began reevaluating their training programs. The term Booker Protocol entered the internal lexicon of at least 5 financial firms, referring to mandatory humility drills in customer service. These weren't just HR initiatives. They were direct responses to the shift in public expectation. A quiet revolution led by a man who never sought to lead. Back in his neighborhood, Elijah didn't change much. He still bought groceries at the same corner store, still sat on his porch with a newspaper. But people started stopping by more. Not for autographs, not for advice, but just to sit. Listen. Say thank you. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 approached him holding a composition notebook. "My mom said you built our school library," he said shyly. Elijah smiled, motioned him to sit down, and asked, "What are you reading?" The boy said, A book about civil rights. Elijah nodded. Good. You're walking the same path I did, just a few steps ahead. Meanwhile, at the bank, a new plaque appeared next to the teller windows, small, unobtrusive, but powerful. It read, "Respect is not a service, it is a starting point." And just when it seemed the story had settled, a final twist arrived, not viral, not public, but personal. Marianne received a sealed letter at her office marked "Private, Eyes Only." Inside was a note in Elijah's handwriting. You once said you wanted to change the system from within. Now you can. I've transferred my shares into a trust, with you as executor. Use it to teach. Use it to protect. Use it to prove that the soul of a bank is not its balance sheet, but its backbone. She stared at the paper, her hands trembling. With that one move, Elijah had made her the guardian of more than stock. He'd made her the guardian of a legacy. Thus ended the response. Not with applause, but with accountability. Not with revenge, but renewal. And as the institution moved forward, one truth rang louder than any slogan, louder than any trend. The most powerful man in the room is often the one who doesn't need to prove it. It's strange, isn't it? How the loudest changes sometimes begin with the quietest people. Elijah Booker never raised his voice. He never filed a lawsuit. He never went on television to shame or name anyone. He simply held up a mirror and let the system see itself. And when that reflection became too uncomfortable to ignore, it wasn't destruction he delivered. It was a second chance. For Bryce McConnell, that second chance wasn't comfortable, but it was transformative. In the months that followed, he didn't just complete his community service or attend his workshops. He applied. He changed. And one day, long after the media storm faded, he knocked on a familiar door in a quiet neighborhood with nothing in his hand but a letter. Elijah opened it slowly, with a calm expression that hadn't aged a day. Bryce handed him the envelope. I know I can't undo what I did, he said, but I want you to know I finally understand why it mattered. Inside the letter was a personal scholarship Bryce had funded in Elijah's name, entirely on his own. It wasn't a corporate move. It wasn't for credit. It was for redemption. Elijah read it, nodded, and replied, Then I believe you've made peace with the mirror. As for Marianne Doyle, the new steward of Elijah's trust, she carried the weight not as a burden, but as a vow. Under her leadership, the bank became known not just for wealth management or high-value accounts, but for something rarer, dignity-based banking. She introduced mentorship programs. She personally reviewed complaint records for bias patterns. She listened, something most institutions forget to do. And for the customers who walked through those doors, something changed too. No more assumptions, no more sideways glances, just service, real, respectful, and human. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Elijah Booker isn't his shares, his speeches, or even his scholarships. It's this simple truth. Power doesn't always look like a man in a suit shouting orders. Sometimes it looks like a man in a cap holding a check, refusing to be small, even when the world tries to make him invisible. So the next time you find yourself sizing someone up, whether in a bank, on a train, or behind a cash register, remember Elijah. And ask yourself, am I seeing the person or just the surface? Because history doesn't always come crashing through the front door. Sometimes it walks in quietly, then changes everything. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Tap that subscribe button to hear more real and powerful stories just like this, where dignity wins, justice speaks, and quiet people remind us what true power really looks like. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment that could change how you see the world. And in the comments below, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone, only to be humbled later? Your story could help someone else see with clearer eyes. This is Radio Life Stories, where every voice matters, and some voices don't need to shout to be heard.